The evening of the 4th of June 1944 was uncomfortable. Normandy was showing its bad side during the day. There had been rain and high winds. I was sitting in a sparsely furnished house on the edge of the village of Belangeville, a few kilometers west of Weimont, a small town east of Caen, the industrial center and port of the Normandy coast. Before me were papers and maps related to exercises I was preparing for my regiment. My adjutant, Lieutenant Helmut Liebskind, was at the command post in the village. I was a 32-year-old major. I was to be promoted to lieutenant colonel at the end of July, and after a further 2 months to colonel rapid progress. It seemed to me the general weather conditions, worked out every day by naval meteorologists and passed on to us by division, gave the all clear for the 5th and 6th of June. So, we did not anticipate any landings. Heavy seas, storms, and low-lying clouds would make large-scale operations at sea and in the air impossible for our opponents. That evening, I felt our lot was highly unsatisfactory. Like most of my men, I was used to mobile actions such as we had fought in other theaters of war. This waiting for an invasion that was undoubtedly coming was unnerving. But in spite of the inactivity, morale among the troops remained high, especially since Normandy spoiled us with butter, cheese, crème fraîche and meat, as well as cider. On that rainy evening, my adjutant and I were waiting for a report from the 2nd Battalion that the night exercise had ended. This battalion was in the area of Traun-Esquiville, fairly near the coast, while the 1st Battalion, equipped with armored personnel carriers and armored half-track vehicles, had taken up waiting positions further to the rear. I had given the basic order that in the event of possible landings by Allied commando troops, the battalions and companies concerned were to attack immediately and independently, disregarding the prohibition from the highest authority on engaging action except after clearance by High Command West. But in view of the weather report we had received, I had no thought of such an engagement that night. About midnight, I heard the growing roar of aircraft passing over us. I wondered whether the attack was destined once again for traffic routes inland or for Germany herself. The planes appeared to be flying very low due to the weather. I looked out the window and was wide awake. Flares were hanging in the sky. At the same moment, my adjutant was on the telephone. Major, paratroops are dropping. Gliders are landing in our section. I'm trying to make contact with the 2nd Battalion. I'll come along to you at once. I gave orders without hesitation. All units are to be put on alert immediately, and the division informed. The 2nd Battalion is to go into action wherever necessary. Prisoners are to be taken, if possible, and brought to me. I then went to the command post with my adjutant. The 5th Company of the 2nd Battalion, which had gone out with blank cartridges, had not yet returned from the night exercise, a dangerous situation. First reports indicated that British paratroops had dropped over Traun. The commander of the 2nd Battalion had already initiated a counterattack with uninvolved elements and had succeeded in penetrating as far as Traun, to which elements of the 5th Company had already withdrawn under their own steam. We telephoned to the company commander, who was in a cellar. Brandenburg. Hold on, the battalion is already attacking and is bound to reach you in a few moments. Okay, he replied. I have the first prisoner here, a British medical officer of the 6th Airborne Division. Send him along as soon as the position is clear. In the meantime, my adjutant telephoned the division. General Foutinguet and his general staff officer had not yet returned. We briefed the orderly officer, Lieutenant Mesmer, on the situation and asked him to obtain clearance for us for a concentrated night attack the moment the divisional commander returned. By now, we had a slightly better idea of and grip on the situation. Prisoners who had misjudged their jumps and fallen into our hands during our limited counterattack were brought to me before I had them escorted away to division, in accordance with orders. During our small talk, we learned that the 6th Airborne Division was supposed to jump during the night in order to take the bridges over the Orne at Ranville intact and form a bridgehead east of the Orne. For the landing by sea, planned for the morning of the 6th of June, gradually we were becoming filled with anger. The clearance for an immediate night attack, to take advantage of the initial confusion among our opponents, had still not come. Although our reports via division to the Corps and to Army Group B Rommel must have long since been on hand, we made a thorough calculation of our chances of successfully pushing through to the coast and preventing the formation of a bridgehead, or at least making it more difficult. I remember the British medical officer who was brought to me as the first prisoner in his parachute equipment. He looked like any other soldier as a good Briton. He kept his composure, but seemed deeply disappointed and unnerved at being taken prisoner on his first mission. Since he too would only give his name and number, I began, as always with a British prisoner, to make small talk. I spoke about my last visit to London in March 1939, about Piccadilly Circus and my British friends, but that he thought, and I learned more about British intentions and the task of the 6th Airborne Division. The hours passed. We had set up a defensive front where we had been condemned to inactivity. The rest of the division, with the Panzer Regiment and Panzer Grenadier Regiment 192, was equally immobilized, though in the highest state of alert. My adjutant telephoned once more to division. Major Foster came to the phone. He too was unable to alter the established orders. Army Group B merely informed us that it was a matter of a diversionary maneuver. The British had thrown out straw dummies on parachutes at daybreak. I sent my adjutant to ask the divisional command post to secure us immediate clearance for a counterattack. On his arrival, Liebskind witnessed a heated telephone conversation which Feuchtinger was evidently having with the army general. "I have just come back from Paris, and I've seen a gigantic armada off the west coast of Caen, warships, supply ships, and landing craft. I want to attack at once with the entire division east of the Orne in order to push through to the coast." But clearance was strictly denied. Hitler, who used to work far into the night, was still asleep that early morning at the command post. I paced up and down and clenched my fists at the indecision of the Supreme Command in the face of the obvious facts. If Rommel had been with us instead of in Germany, he would have disregarded all orders and taken action. Of that we were convinced. We felt completely fit physically and able to cope with the situation. I concealed my anger and remained calm and matter of fact. My experience in previous theaters of war had taught me that the more critical a situation, or the more alarming the reports, the more calmly every experienced leader should react. The best way to calm an excited orderly officer or a dispatch rider coming straight from an apparently desperate situation is to sit him down, give him a cigarette, and say, "Now tell me what has actually happened." So the tragedy took its course. After only a few hours, the brave fighting units in the coastal fortifications could no longer withstand the enemy pressure, or else they were smashed by the Allied naval guns, while a German panzer division, ready to engage, lay motionless behind the front. Powerful Allied bomber formations, thanks to complete air superiority, covered the coastal divisions and Caen with concentrated attacks. In the early hours of the morning, from the hills east of Caen, we saw the gigantic Allied armada, the fields littered with transport gliders, and the numerous observation balloons over the landing fleet, with the help of which the heavy naval guns subjected us to precision fire. The situation forced us to regroup. Strong combat units were formed on either side of the Orne, east and west. We continued to wait for clearance for a counterattack. In view of this superiority, I thought, on seeing the landing fleet, there was no longer much chance of throwing the Allies back into the sea. Bringing up reserves was even now extremely difficult for us. The second front had been established. The enemy in the east, pressing with superior strength, the ceaseless bombing of our most important industrial centers and railway communications, even the bravest and most experienced troops could no longer win this war. A successful invasion, I thought, was the beginning of the end. What we didn't know at the time was some information which came into my hands at the beginning of May 1987. Werner Kordenhaus, a former tank commander in our division and the author of History of the 21st Panzer Division, made available to me 2 letters that had been sent to him at the end of 1979 by General Speidel, formerly Chief of Staff of Army Group B. Here follows an extract from the letter of the 26th of October 1979. I called Feuchtinger between 1 and 2 a.m. on the 6th of June 1944, but couldn't get him. It was not until the morning of the 6th of June that my first general staff officer got through to him. Foettinger had a general directive to attack at once in the event of an airborne landing. Extract from the letter of the 15th of November 1979. The 21st Panzer Division had orders to go into action at once if the enemy made an airborne landing, and with the whole division in fact. This general order to attack at once in full strength, hence with my whole combat group, during that very night of 5th to 6th June, in the event of an airborne landing, was known neither to me nor to my adjutant at the time, the later General Liebskind of the Bundeswehr. Neither apparently did the other units in the division know of this order. Instead, we all adhered to the strict order not to carry out even the smallest operation until it had been cleared by Army Group B. The divisional staff must have known of the other order, as is clear from General Speidel's letters. The question arises, if I had known of the order to take action in the event of airborne landings, I would, on my own responsibility, have launched an attack with the whole regiment, reinforced by the Becker Assault Gun Battalion, against the airborne landings east of the Orne. It is my firm opinion, and that of my adjutant at the time, that by exploiting the initial confusion among the enemy after their descent, we would have succeeded in pushing through to the coast, and probably also in regaining possession of the two bridges over the Orne at Bénouville. Parallel operations would then have been started also by Regiment 192 and the Panzer Regiment. This would not have been enough to prevent the invasion as a whole, but there would probably have been a delay in the seaborne landing with great losses for the British, an example of how imprecise issuing of orders can have an adverse effect on a large operation. Further highly interesting information came into my hands at the beginning of June 1987 through a former captain on the General Staff, later General Wegmann of the Bundeswehr, who had given it to Lieutenant Colonel Bechtold of the Bundeswehr, a student of the invasion at the beginning of May 1987. From May to July 1944, Wegmann had been posted to the divisional staff for training, and during the night of 5th to 6th June, he was deputizing for the first General Staff Officer, who was in Paris with Foettinger. Wegmann reported that late in the evening of the 5th of June 1944, the division's radio company had picked up a British clear text radio message that indicated the loading of transport gliders. This report had been passed on after the first reports of airborne landings. He had at once alerted the whole division and informed Foettinger in Paris. Between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning of the 6th of June, Foettinger had then arrived at the command post with his General Staff Officer. Between 6 and 7 o'clock, we were all surprised that Speidel, in his call at 2 o'clock in the morning of the 6th of June, knowing of the general directive, had not given the order to attack airborne enemy forces at once with all available elements in my sector east of the Orne. The fact that in the critical hours it was left to uninformed divisional commanders to cope with the situation seems to me, in retrospect, inexcusable. On the night of 5th to 6th June 1944, Lance Corporal Hamel had been assigned to guard duty. He belonged to Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 21 of our division, which was lying in reserve in positions near a village south of Cayenne. As Hamel was later to relate, the inactivity upset us greatly. We had always been in action as scouts, and as the spearhead of the division, now we had been stationed there for weeks, waiting for something that might not affect us at all, the landing on orders from Rommel. We had to carry out exercises by night almost every day, so that in the event of airborne landings, we would be familiar with the terrain as far as the coast. To occupy ourselves, we had to set up Rommel's asparagus as a defense against gliders, and also prepare fortifications in the area behind the Atlantic Wall. Suddenly, at midnight on the 5th to the 6th of June, all hell broke loose. From my post, I could see flares in the sky, followed by a concentrated air raid on nearby Cayenne. Now the fun begins, was my first thought. Lieutenant Ruprecht Kazamek of the Reconnaissance Battalion remembers it clearly. During that same night, from the 5th to the 6th of June, we were alerted that paratroops and gliders had landed in the sector of Panzer Grenadier Regiment 125 under Major von Luck. Together with the bombing of Cayenne, this suggested more than a commando operation. We knew the order to attack only on orders from the highest authority. In spite of that, within a very short time, the battalion was ready for action, Our commander, Major Waldo, was on leave and due back on the 8th of June. At dawn, a liaison officer whom we had sent to Von Luck reported that not only had an airborne division landed east of the Orne, but the enemy had brought up a vast armada off the coast and was preparing a landing from the sea. Heavy naval guns now joined in the landing operations. The weak units on the coast were apparently already involved in fierce fighting. Soon after came the order the battalion is attached to Von Luck's combat group and will move off at once in the direction of Tron, about 12 kilometers east of Caen. By making full use of cover, we reached the area just west of Tron in the early afternoon, more or less without interference. Lance Corporal Hemmel later recalled that, as we moved forward to the northeast, we saw around midday on the 6th of June 2 Messerschmitt fighters flying north low over the Orne, the only German aircraft that day east of Caen. The first British paratroops to be killed from their parachute silk. We cut ourselves scarves as protection against the dust. Our commander's deputy gave us the order to attack. We went into the attack practically from the march. Further west, we could hear the sounds of battle. That was where our armored group was supposed to attack. The enemy was apparently concentrating his naval fire against this. For him, dangerous thrust. His air force was also in action there. So we made good progress as far as the outskirts of Esquiville, hence only a few kilometers from Ranville and the two bridges over the Orne. In the early morning of the 6th of June, the situation and issuing of orders in the face of the airborne landings, the armada of warships, merchantmen, and landing craft, and the incipient landing from the sea were more than confusing. Despite the supposed general directive, we had not received permission to attack during the night. Even in the early morning, Inge did not receive clearance for his division to counter-attack. The Commander-in-Chief West, von Rundstedt, was of the opinion, as was Hitler's high command, that this was a diversionary maneuver. The real landing was expected in the Pass de Calais. Our Corps commander, General Marx, on the other hand, thought the landing was genuine. Rommel, we heard, was en route to his HQ without having met Hitler. So the night and the first hours of the 6th of June went by too late. Much too late, was how it seemed to us. We were dismayed and angry that we had not been believed by the highest authority. Finally, General Marx, whether authorized to do so or not, ordered our division to attack at once with the whole division east of the Orne, and smash the units of the 6th Airborne Division that had landed there and cut their communications with the West. While the necessary orders were being issued and the division was forming itself for attack, the extent of the sea landings became evident. In the middle of our movements, which were constantly harassed by British planes, came a new order. This time from the 7th Army. The bulk of the 21st Panzer Division will attack the enemy forces that have landed west of the Orne. Only elements of von Luck's combat group will attack the bridgehead east of the Orne. This involved time and further losses from air attacks. The regrouping of the division took hours. Most of the units from the area east of Caen and the Orne had to squeeze through the eye of the needle at Caen and over the only bridges available in this sector. Caen was under virtually constant bombardment from the Navy and the fighter-bombers of the Royal Air Force. Fotintinger informed me that an armored group, including my battalion in SPUBUS Schützenpanzerwagen armored personnel carriers, was to push through to the coast west of the Orne. His orders to me: you will attack with your battalion, reinforced by Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 21, and Assault Gun Battalion 200, and a platoon of anti-tank guns east of the Orne. Your task is to crush the 6th Airborne's bridgehead, recapture the 2 Orne bridges at Benouville, and establish contact with the coastal units. Elements of artillery will support you. Start the attack as soon as all elements have reached you. The employment of the Reconnaissance Battalion worried me greatly. I had, after all, seen action in all theaters of war as an armored scout, always as the spearhead of the division. We were not equipped for direct attacking operations. No. 4 Company of the Panzer Regiment arrived toward 5 p.m. On the 6th of June, Major Becker's batteries not until the night of the 7th of June, so I had to start without them. My 2nd Battalion was engaged in heavy defensive fighting against the paratroops that had landed, who were obviously trying to extend their as yet very small bridgehead. I could free only limited elements of the battalion for the attack. In the late afternoon, almost at the same time as the armored group west of the Orne, we set off. Our goal to push through via Esquiville, Herivillette, to Ranville and the two Orne bridges. The reconnaissance battalion went straight into the attack from its march and, supported by the Panzer Company, penetrated to Esquiville against their surprised opponents. Then all hell broke loose. The heaviest naval guns, up to 38 centimeters in caliber, artillery, and fighter bombers plastered us without pause. Radio contacts were lost, wounded came back, and the men of the reconnaissance battalion were forced to take cover. I had gone up with the attack and saw the disaster. I managed to run forward to the commander of the battalion and gave him fresh orders to avoid further heavy losses, break off the attack at once, and take up defensive positions on the southern edge of Esquiville. Set up a line of defense there and prevent any further enemy advance. Number 4 Company of the Panzer Regiment, as well as Major Becker's assault guns when they get here, will support you. See that your men, and also the crews of the armored cars, dig themselves in. I ran back to my regiment's radio station. My adjutant Liebskind had to report the breaking off of the attack to the division. At the same time, Futinger sent word that the armored group had reached the coast through the gap between the landed elements of the British 3rd Infantry Division and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Heavy fire from the Navy, relays of attacks by fighter bombers, and in the rear of the armored group, newly landed paratroops had forced them to withdraw to avoid being encircled. My sister regiment, 192, had taken up a defensive position at about the same level as us. Now the very thing Rommel had feared had happened. The enemy had not been attacked by our whole division and thrown back into the sea in the first hours of the landing. The other 2 panzer divisions were lying in areas far to the rear. Of the 1,000 fighters that Göring had promised, nothing was to be seen. Now on the evening of the 6th of June, it seemed to have become clear even to Hitler that it must be a matter of a large-scale invasion. But, as Futinger told us, Hitler and his high command still reckoned on a further landing in the Pas de Calais. The panzer divisions and reserve units stationed there were not to be withdrawn, on express orders from Hitler. At the same time, it was also clear to the last man that the invasion had succeeded, that it could now be only a matter of days or weeks before the Allies would have landed sufficient forces to be able to mount an attack on Paris, and finally on the German Reich. If it were not for that damned air superiority, even by night Christmas trees hung in the sky, bathing the whole area in bright light. The air attacks never stopped. The Navy laid a barrage of fire on our positions and bombarded the city of Caen, which was a focal point in our lateral communications. By day, it was even worse. At any movement on the battlefield, even of an individual vehicle, the enemy reacted with concentrated fire from the Navy or attacks by fighter bombers. Either our radio communications were being intercepted, or the Navy had divided up the whole area into grid squares and had only to pass on the square number to launch a sudden concentration of fire against such concentrations. And for the night, we all dug foxholes beside our vehicles, which provided some protection. All our supplies came from the Paris area and could be moved only by night. During the night of the 7th of June, I received orders to continue the attacks on Esquiville. Also on the following days, we must try to crush the bridgehead east of the Orne, which as yet is small, was the message from our divisional commander. Then in the morning, we saw on the rising ground north of Esquiville up to 100 gliders lying in the fields, a sign that further units of the 6th Airborne Division had landed. Units of the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion were still dug in on the southern edge of Esquiville. A combat patrol forced its way into the village and suffered heavy losses, but brought out 13 prisoners. One of them talked. We had the task of attacking southward through Esquiville to extend the bridgehead and reach our original objective. We are only waiting for reinforcements. Back at my command post, I got into conversation with an NCO of the 6th Airborne Division. He was slightly wounded and was just being treated by our doctor. He thanked us for his fair treatment, but was somewhat embittered. I belonged to B Company under Major John Howard. We had the task of landing at midnight with 6 gliders by the 2 Orne bridges near Benouville and taking the bridges intact. We had been trained for this operation for over a year. We landed right by the bridges the enemy were taken completely by surprise. They didn't even have time to carry out the prepared demolitions. I think we were the very first to land on French soil. We were mighty proud, especially since we had only a few casualties. Major Howard had told us that after the operation had succeeded, we would be flown back to England to be held in readiness for another action. Then yesterday evening, our major received orders to attack the village of Esquiville. This morning, the little bridgehead had to be extended, a task for which, in my opinion, we were never intended. We forced our way into the village, but came under heavy fire from all sides, especially from your bloody 88s. I believe more than half our company had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. After the feeble resistance at the bridges, we seem to have stumbled here on a strong, battle-tried opponent. Our major was so proud of the coup de main, and now this disaster. All the same, we know our landing from the sea has been successful. You can't stop us anymore from marching on Paris before long. You can't win this war anymore. One of the bridges is known today as Pegasus Bridge, so called after the flying horse emblem of the British Airborne Forces. Meanwhile, reports were coming in from our right flank. My 2nd Battalion was engaged in heavy defensive fighting, especially on the right flank near and north of Tron. On no account must the enemy break through there. On the 7th of June, its commander, Captain Curzon, was killed. He was promoted posthumously to Major and awarded the Knight's Cross. Lieutenant Brandenburg, who with his 5th Company had been the first to make contact with the enemy during the night of the 6th, was also killed. Both were buried in ground to the rear and later reinterred. These were heavy losses for us all. Divisions sent Major Courts of the Reserve that same day as the new commander of the battalion. He was an infantryman and had been in Russia in that respect. He was very suitable for the immediate task. Within a short while, he had integrated himself and became one of my most reliable and successful leaders in the combat group. On the 8th of June, neither we nor the British attacked on both sides. The wounded had to be cared for and casualties replaced. To our surprise, a few Messerschmitts suddenly appeared. They were at once involved in an air battle. The Royal Air Force fighter was shot down over the British lines. The men all raised their arms in jubilation. Were the promised 1,000 fighters about to turn up after all? But a Messerschmitt was also shot down. The pilot was able to save himself by parachute and landed near the reconnaissance battalion. He was brought along to me. He swore and waved his arms about. What are we supposed to do with a couple of fighters against this superiority? Where the hell are the 1,000 fighter planes? We didn't know either. In the afternoon, Major Waldo reported back from leave. His men of the reconnaissance battalion were glad he was very popular, especially as he stuck up for them and always tried to avoid unnecessary losses. At the same time as Waldo came, an order also came from Division von Luck's combat group will assemble on the morning of the 9th of June for a decisive attack on Esquiville, advance on Ranville, and take possession of the Orne bridges assigned to it. For this purpose, Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 21, No. 4 Company of Panzer Regiment 22, 3 batteries of Major Becker's Assault Gun Battalion 200, and 1 company of Anti-Tank Battalion 220 with 8.8 centimeter guns. The division's artillery will support the attack within the limits of its supply of ammunition. Late that evening, all the commanders along with an artillery observer gathered at my post. We assembled before dawn, before the enemy air force could intervene or the navy be effective. The motorcycle escorts of the reconnaissance battalion and the grenadiers of the 2nd Battalion, not tied down by the enemy, will lead, followed by the 1st Battalion and supported by the tanks of No. 4 Company, as well as Becker's SPWs. The anti-tank guns will take up positions on the hill south of Esquiville to ward off counterattacks by British tanks. It would take a powerful and effective combat group to offset the impact of the naval guns and fighter bombers. We assembled an hour before dawn. I traveled with a little command group behind the reconnaissance battalion so that I could make decisions on the spot. During the night, we had been plastered with heavy naval fire and bombs our preparations had evidently been spotted. Lance Corporal Hamill, who took part in the attack as a motorcycle escort, recalls with support from the tanks and assault guns, we soon forced our way into Esquivel. The remaining civilian population had gathered by the church. We found a few children running around looking for their parents. We took them to the church. The British of the 6th Airborne Division put up fierce resistance. When it became light, heavy fire from the Navy began to fall on the center of the village and its southern edge. We could make no progress. Then the news reached us that our beloved commander, Major Waldo, had been killed only a day after coming back from leave. This was a blow to us all. We couldn't even recover his body at first because of the barrage of fire. It was not until after dark that a patrol of volunteers, whom the British, in fairness, allowed to pass, was able to bring Major Waldo back and bury him further to the rear. Later, the British transferred him to their military cemetery in Ranville, where he found his last rest among his former enemies. Waldo's death greatly affected me personally. During the course in Paris, I had often had talks with him, from which I could infer his contempt for Hitler. As I heard later, he had belonged to the wide circle of the men of the 20th of July 1944. I had told Waldo of Rommel's prophecy. He too had set his hopes on Rommel. Waldo was an officer of the old Prussian school, highly decorated in Russia, modest, and always considerate of the welfare of his men. His sister told me later, for example, that he had once been in a Russian village surrounded by partisans. The inhabitants had had nothing to eat for days. Waldo thereupon distributed his men's rations among the women and children. During the night, a deputation of partisans suddenly appeared. "German, you have given our women and children food. We thank you for that. You may leave the village tonight with your men. We will not attack." A sign of humanity on both sides. Captain Brandt from the division's reserve of officers took over the reconnaissance battalion in place of Waldo. For Werner Kortenhaus, at that time a tank commander in No. 4 Company, the 9th of June became a nightmare. That day was for us one of the hardest actions ever. We assembled with about 10 tanks under the trees of the avenue south of Esquivel. We drove with closed ports, one tank after the other, to the right, past the chateau, into a large meadow which was enclosed by hedges. There we intended to switch to broad wedge formation for attack. The grenadiers behind and alongside us. Then everything happened very quickly. Within a few minutes, we had lost 4 tanks, knocked out by the naval guns. On my tank, a Mark IV with the short barrel. The turret jammed so that I could only shoot into the hedges with my machine gun. The fire became more intense, so that on orders from Major von Luck, we had to withdraw, as did the grenadiers. The artillery fire continued unabated. Some 30 or 40 grenadiers must have been killed by it. On the evening of the 9th of June, we realized that we could no longer drive the British back into the sea. In 1960, when the ruins of the chateau were still standing, I went over the action again on the spot.